might get a message that comes up about that. And here we go. Let me find my slides. Can everyone see that? Thank you. So welcome to today's event. As I said, we'll be looking at co-production, power sharing and shared decision making. Our calling question today is, how can participatory arts practice empower people and communities? We'll have presentations from Chrissy Tiller, who is a writer, thinker, practitioner, evaluator, educator. She wears many hats. And she wrote the kind of go-to handbook called Power Up, which is a report exploring the complexities of sharing power in the context of the Creative People and Places programme. And I think she'll be talking a bit about that and some of her other research and practice around these themes. Abby Horsfield is a member of Collective Encounters and is our outreach director. Abby embeds creativity and theatre for social change in geographic communities in Merseyside through our Above and Beyond project, and also is involved with our participant advisory group, which makes decisions alongside the Board of Trustees around the practice and work of Collective Encounters. Sorry if I'm a bit froggy today. I've got a bit of a cough. So how today will work is we'll have our presentations at the beginning from our two colleagues, and after that we'll have an open Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat throughout, or if you have difficulty doing that, put your hand up and we'll field them from the cohort today. And then we'll have a short break, and after the break we'll be commencing an open space discussion where we will decide on an agenda together and open breakout rooms that you can freely move around to explore more of the kind of complexities and nuts and bolts of these themes. Great, I'm going to stop sharing there. Fab. And so Chrissy is going to be our first speaker this morning. If Harriet could highlight Chrissy, thank you. Welcome, Chrissy.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for the introduction, Marianne. So I don't have to do too much of an introduction myself, but I want to thank you and Collective Encounters for inviting me this morning to speak. I always have interesting encounters with Collective Encounters. So that's great. I'm going to start this morning. I'm going to speak a lot about power sharing in one way or other, but I want to start by saying I am old. I say that because I've actually begun to realize over the past couple of years in particular during COVID time, that actually age, especially for women, is a form of oppression and marginalization. I've just begun to realize how quickly we disappear and how quickly our views and even the sort of supposedly seminal things that we write also disappear too. So it's interesting because I'm actually at the moment at the age of 72 writing a PhD, which I've been given a fellowship to do by the Technological Institute in Dublin, about my experiences and my practice and my thinking as a working class woman in the cultural sector, and looking at how that has informed almost everything that I've done over the past 40 or 50 years. So one of the things that was mentioned for us to speak about this morning was, and why it seems relevant to think about myself as old, is to talk about the possibilities of cultural democracy. Now, I'm old enough to recognize that cultural democracy is not a new idea. I'm writing in my PhD about Raymond Williams' Culture is Ordinary, which he was writing as a working class lad in the 1950s, struggling to bring something like that about, struggling to think about how much we might be able to bring that about. And I'm also old enough, if not quite, to actually remember But to know that our very first Minister of Arts, Jenny Lee, in 1961, wanted to bring about some kind of cultural democracy, some kind of power sharing, some kind of equality in the arts. She tried to do it by funding community arts centres all around the UK, and some of those still exist, are important. But where she got stuck was with the power of the cultural elite and the power of the major institutions who insisted that they still have more than a third, a few major institutions in London, of the funding and the power that was available. So they were the people who were going to bring democracy, the democratization of culture, to working people. They were not going to go right to the grassroots and find what working people wanted. I'm also old enough to be actually been involved in what Owen Kelly describes as the expression of cultural democracy, which he calls the radical community arts movement in the 70s and in the early 80s. It was a movement where artists felt they had to be embedded in their communities, to work with their communities. But also part of this, especially under the GLC in London, where I was involved and engaged, was knowing that we needed to understand the politics of greater equality and social justice, and understanding that as artists, we needed to be part of working with communities in the struggle for all kinds of equality, rather than just focusing on something that we called cultural democracy. I'm also old enough to see what happened under Thatcherism and the destruction of this whole concept of community, and to have lived through 12 years of the instrumentalization of the arts under New Labour, which helped deliver Thatcher's neoliberal politics of market forces and the customer being the driving force of who had funding in the arts, and the arts, participatory arts or community arts or socially engaged arts, whatever we want to call it, really being there to provide some kind of fairly cheap social services to those communities that were considered more marginalized. I'm old enough to remember Owen Kelly's storming the Citadel in the 1980s, in the middle of the 1980s. And his warning that what had eventually defeated the politicization of the community arts movement and its radicalism was the need to begin chasing the funding streams, realizing that the funding streams were where the power was, the funding streams were what going to dictate what happened, and that eventually the community arts movement lost its way. So I'd like to go back to Owen Kelly and his definition of cultural democracy, which I always find a useful touchstone. And his definition is that it's about equality of access to the means of cultural production and distribution. And for those of you who know your Marxism, you'll know that it's just a little twist on Marxist philosophy. But what I think is really important, what he's saying there, is equality of access, not just to what somebody else has decided is going to be culture for us, but to the means of cultural production, and even more important, to its distribution, which means the curation, which means making the policies, which means making the decisions about who has funding, which is making the decisions about what's happened. So as far as I'm concerned, and following in Kelly, is that cultural democracy will never, ever be about something like the Arts Council, however arm's length it is from the government, making top-down decisions. It's not about the democratization of culture, which is a system which privileges, continues to privilege the dissemination of the culture, dominant cultural forms, however nice those might be, and however much we might want to go to opera and see working class people accessing opera and theatre and traditional theatre and things like mainstream theatre. But it's about addressing the systemic inequality of who has access by creating a framework where equal access is not only to the enjoyment of the arts or the participation in the arts as an audience or audience development, but about who has access to the making, as I said, the curation, the distribution, the decisions about what kind of culture we are going to support. I think in these times, in COVID times, it's also made us realize but it means acknowledging that unless we change things like working class access to the safety nets, which the middle classes and the dominant culture have always been able to draw on, the situation in this country is only going to get worse. Cultural democracy, as far as I'm concerned, is never separate from social justice. And I wanted just to go on to explain that, for me, my roots are in radical pedagogy. I learned to be a drama and education teacher at a time when Williams was writing, at a time when I had Tony Harrison, the poet, the radical poet, as my tutor. But it was a time when I also encountered Freire and realized and recognized within radical pedagogy the need to set out a level playing field where different knowledges are always valued, where different voices are respected in the room. And what seems really importantly to me, where language and the ability to have access to language and therefore a voice belongs to everyone. And one of the other things I've been rereading Owen Kelly a lot recently, you'll probably gather, but what he also noted was one of the weaknesses of community arts movement was that it decided theory was a luxury. They had to find the funding, they had to do the project, but actually theory was a luxury that they didn't have time for at that time. So that when it came to the crunch of being challenged, of not finding the funding that was available, of having something coming in like neoliberal views about who had access, how the art could be used, they had no shared theory and no shared language. So that's what I've been trying to do for the past 20 odd years, is to give access to language and knowledge that enables us as workers in the arts, as cultural workers, to understand things such as the power structures, the cultural hegemonies, cultural capital, and inequalities, and recognize that unless we understand these, we will never be able to bring about real cultural democracy. I've tried to find ways too to alert people to the need to resist the depoliticization and co-option of this language by the cultural hegemony and the mainstream. Because you see the language of socially engaged art in cultural policy, but you don't see the realization of socially engaged arts and participatory arts in the practice. So it's something I really started pulling together when I set up the MA at Goldsmiths in cross-spectral and community arts in 2004. And as Marianne mentioned, it has its latest iteration in my publication, Power Up. But what I've learned in the past few months, because it's been part of my PhD thinking, is I've gone back to reread Black feminists on power. And what I've begun to realize is we cannot think about power without recognizing it in the context of a drive towards social justice. And that it also cannot be separated from anger. And that's been really exciting and interesting for me to reread Lord and Hooks and people like this on the use of anger. Not that kind of ordinary everyday anger that's a response to the train that's cancelled or the Zoom link that's not working or things like that, but actually working with one's apt and righteous anger, which is part of one's rage against the inequities and social justices of this world, which at the moment we know are increasing constantly and are becoming more and more. We're living in a more and more unequal and unjust society. And what I've realized in thinking about language and thinking about anger is what Audre Lorde explains, that we can use anger and our own experience as a source of knowledge and a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. An act of clarification which moves us to action. And as she goes on to explain, to the possibility of real transformation rather than tweaking around at the edges. And as Hooks notes, owning marginality, our own marginality, often as women, as older people, as people from ethnic minorities, as people who have come from migrant backgrounds, who often work in this more participatory context of owning our own marginality as a site of resistance, but also of beginning to theorize, to draw on theory. Hooks explains that she went to theory when she was in pain. and that actually theory helped her pain, realizing that there was a theory that could explain what was happening. And when she talks about, you know, it helps us to explain the experience aesthetically and critically, and then it begins to enable us to have an agenda. So art, when everyone is invited to the table, I would argue has a capacity to help shift our sense of what's possible, to unleash our radical imaginations, to model experiment with new ways of being in the world, of new ways to enact social change. And I just sense, in being asked to make a provocation this morning, that the increasing inequity of our time would seem to demand a new and fierce urgency for the arts to just do that. In 2010, following what Nicholas Sirota called the Blitzkrieg of cuts imposed by Cameron on the arts in the new age of austerity, and the imposition of that on the most vulnerable organisations, artists, and people within arts and culture, along with my colleague and longtime friend and activist, Jenny Harris, we organised an unconference, Taking Part, which was about participation not only in arts and culture, but participation in society and the need for the arts to be part of both. And it was a call to action, and it brought people working in socially engaged social arts, community arts from across the world, from countries that were already seeing, like Hungary and Turkey, the rise of the right, the rise of nationalism, the ways that all these things that we're seeing here in the UK and in the world generally were impacting not only on culture, but on society as a whole. And someone there mentioned towards the end of the plenary a quote that they recalled from Studs Terkel, who was writing in the 1960s about American society and the lack of equality. And his quote was that hope always rises up, it never trickles down. So I think that this is a time for those of you who are working like Collective Encounters, for those artists that I've already seen in the audience, for those who are working to share power, to bring about more participation, meaningful participation, is to bring up, to call something together, to initiate a call for action that says we are not going to just remain in the cultural sector, we are prepared to be involved with our communities, to challenge the inequities of our society before our new Minister of Culture destroys everything we've all fought for and hoped for over the past few decades. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. I remove your spotlight. Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Chrissy, for that kind of web of things, language, anger, action, inequity, inequality that are all linked and can be linked through a social justice and arts movement. And I think that's all given us something to really think about, that provocation. Thank you. So I'd like to, before we hand over to Abby, is there any questions for Chrissy before we continue? We have lots of praise in the chat. Simon says, reminds me of another quote, power is taken, not given. Perfect, thank you. We'll return to some questions at the end of Abby's presentation then. So thank you, Chrissy, and welcome to Abby.
Hello, thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Chrissy. Really interesting. And I think maybe what I'm going to talk about leads on to a way that we at Collective Encounters are looking at power and power sharing within our outreach programme and getting people in the community to engage. So I'll launch straight in. As you heard, I'm the outreach director at Collective Encounters, and part of my job is to really engage communities and individuals in co-creating pieces of radical theatre that give voice to what's important to them. In short, I call myself a facilitator of participatory theatre for social change, and that participatory is at the heart of what I do. I'm going to talk about the shared decision making that's gone on with Above and Beyond, which is a Paul Hamlin funded project which aims to embed creativity and theatre for social change in geographical communities. So it's quite a privilege. I feel a little bit like Chrissy said, I'm going back to some of the work I did in the late 80s, early 90s, where we were able to go into communities and really work within that community. Because I think some of the work has been around community of interest or identification, so you can get funding for pockets within communities, but actually to have the privilege to work with a whole geographic space, to work with people of all types in a community is a rare and wonderful thing. When I started Above and Beyond, I went in knowing that you can only co-create with people participating. And so you have to engage community members, you have to engage community organisations, networks, partnerships, decision makers, because without all of those people engaging in a project, the project begins to fall down or unravel. And so I did some research both out in the communities but also desk-based research, and then I went onto the streets and I asked 2 questions of anyone I could find who might talk to me, and they were, what issues are important to you, and do you think theatre has any place in telling your story? And I went out and I asked people, and then I started to communicate with organisations, and the organisations enabled me to go into those organisations to work with their participants to ask the same 2 questions through creative pathways. So we use creative means to get people exploring and expressing what issues are important to them, and does theatre have a place in telling your story? And I'm really pleased to say that to the second question, the answer was a resounding yes. People said yes, they think theatre had a place in telling a story. And the issues that came out, as expected, were varied from really big political issues to small neighbourhood issues, but those issues were there. But the interesting thing, and the thing that I didn't really expect, was that as I got talking to people in both the 2 communities, one was Bootle in the north of Liverpool, South Sefton, which borders Liverpool, and one was Birkenhead on the Wirral. In both communities, it became very clear very early on from both organisations and individuals in the community saying, we don't want a piece of theatre that mirrors our daily struggle. We don't want to see our daily struggle on theatre. We want something more. And so that was coming out and blooming in the community. And in about 9 months into the project, we took the step to set up our participatory advisory group. Took a bit of time to set up because we needed to get into the community and get known and get trusted and build up the trust in the community to want people to engage. And the aim of the participatory advisory group, I'm going to call it the PAG group, which is how we refer to it, was to really look at steering the work, to look at the objectives of the project we were doing, to interrogate them, to really see, is this what the community needs and wants? Are we doing it right? What can we change? And to look at the evaluation, how are we going to measure that within the community? So I went out and I invited people who we've been working with in organisations to join the PAG group. I invited people who'd participated in workshops with us in community to join the PAG group, and also looked at the wider Collective Encounters family and people we'd been working with for a period of time in Collective Encounters who lived in those geographical locations to come and be part of a group that steered the work that we were doing in those communities. And as I said, the first task of the PAG was to set the project outlines and objectives. We employed an external evaluator to work with us, and we looked at the objectives that have been outlined in the funding bid, and we looked at prioritising them and which were key, renaming, rewording, interrogating, and really looking at what were we doing the right thing and how would we change to fit with the knowledge that the experts in experience who live in the community had to bring to the project so that we were on the right track. And once we'd done that, we then looked at setting an evaluation framework to look at how are we going to measure that and how are we going to, how's that going to be accountable? How are we going to make sure we're doing what the PAG group wanted us to do? And Claire worked with the group on setting up an evaluation toolkit to support PAG members in being instrumental in that evaluation as well, with both training, but also accessibility of language was a really important thing. And that document went backwards and forwards to make sure that it was a usable document that used language that everyone understood. And as a facilitator, I'm just going to be really honest, it was a really interesting and sometimes difficult process, because as someone who's worked in community arts for a long, long time and has often gone into communities, always asking questions, to suddenly be, to have that real power, that real honest power sharing, and to be steered in that different way was sometimes tricky. Sometimes I had one idea and the PAG group had a completely other, but because we're looking at that sort of democracy and that shared decision making, it was me that would have to adapt my thinking and to really pick up on what the PAG group was saying and to really start that honest communication. And we started to get that to work really well. And simultaneously in the community, I was also setting up core groups of actors who were people who'd engaged in the participatory outreach work, and to bring them into a core group so that we could upskill them in theatre training as well, the language of theatre, making theatre, how we make theatre, so that we were, as well as exploring issues and speaking about what the community were coming and making in the outreach workshops, that group were all also learning how to make theatre, because the idea was that we were going to look at creating a wonderful piece of community-based, interactive, participatory theatre that was going to tour the communities in the autumn of 2020. And the PAG group were going to look at what the theme was and work with the core group, and we were going to make this wonderful piece of theatre. And then lockdown happened. And as far as we got with lockdown, the PAG group had looked at agreeing the timetable and looked at the production needs that we might need. And they'd also looked at all the material that we had generated and had decided the theme should be hope. And hope in community was what the piece should be about. And that had come out of the community. But lockdown stopped us in our tracks. And initially, you know, as with everybody with collective encounters, we were forced to put things on Zoom to find new ways of working and to do that. And we spent a lot of the first lockdown within the core groups that were meeting online individually. We had 2 communities and then we brought them together. And some of the PAG group members joined the core groups at that stage because they wanted to stay involved with the theatre. And we spent a lot of time looking at and trying to understand our changing world and using the time we had together on Zoom to create pieces of film theatre that looked at how we understand our new changing world. And then we started to move beyond that and think beyond lockdown and to think back to that theme of hope. And we did a scratch piece where we looked at, could we make a piece of digitally born theatre that gave voice to what the communities, what come out of the community research we'd done. And in autumn 20, we had a joint meeting with the PAG and core group and decided we were going to go ahead with the creation of a digitally born piece of theatre. And we were going to engage a digital theatre maker, and we were going to move forward. So the PAG group and the core group were very decisive that that should happen. And it very much came that is what we wanted to do. And the PAG group were part of the interview, making the interview questions, interviewing, appointing the digital artist. And when we started to look at production meetings, creative meetings, marketing meetings, there were PAG group members in those groups that were driving those processes. So the confidence had been built throughout the PAG meetings for people to really actively take a role in really pushing the agenda, to refer back to what community members would want, to constantly be that voice of the community in that creation process. And we were all upskilled by that experience. The piece we made is called The Legend of the Moniks, and we improvised around the scenes. We developed in the way you would do with any group, but we had at the heart of that people who'd never done this before, who'd never been in a creative team before, people who'd never been in a production meeting, people who'd never done marketing. And they were people with lived experience, real experience of the community, who were asking questions, who were constantly referring back to their needs, to what the community was saying. And it really was, I think, the most collaborative shared decision-making, theatre-making process I've ever been involved with. And I think that everyone came away from it feeling that it really was representative of what the community had wanted to say throughout the research period, throughout lockdown, and throughout the creative process. And if you haven't seen The Legend of the Moniks, do look, because every piece of that was generated and created by people in the community. And people were upskilled, I was upskilled. It was a real learning process for us all. And you can find it on Collective Encounters website, or just any search engine. The Legend of the Moniks will get you there. We're now moving into phase 2 of Above and Beyond. We're coming out of lockdown. We are moving from just working in Bootle and Birkenhead, where we've been working for a long time, where we've started to really embed that creative practice and work with organisations within in the area, with individuals in the area, to look at the continuation of the creation of theatre and creativity. And we're now moving into a new geographical location in Knowsley. And our PAG group is now busy looking at what went well, what worked well, what didn't work so well, what we'd keep, what we'd change, new ideas for how we can make that process inclusive and as brilliant as it can be in Knowsley. And we're looking to bring into the PAG group members of the Knowsley community who are experts in their area to help shape the project and make it work in this new community we're working in. And I think as a company, strategically, we've really learned from having the PAG group. And I think what we're looking at most definitely is the value of having participatory advisory groups in all of our participatory programs, so that we are really being led by the participants that engage with us and the communities we're working in. So I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you, Abby. Great. That was lovely to hear about how you've used shared decision making in practice, both in the creation of a really exciting digitally born theatre piece and as part of the participant advisory group. That's really interesting. Thank you. So we've heard from both of our speakers today who come from kind of different places of looking at these themes. It would be great to open the floor to see if anyone has any questions for Chrissy or Abby. Now we've got some things in the chat. Gilly asks, Chrissy, would love to have you share any references of texts that you mentioned that are kind of key texts for these or writers for us to read around these themes, cultural democracy and shared decision making.
Yeah, I'll happily put a little list together of things that I've just been looking at recently, you know, about cultural democracy. I mean, just go to African American feminists if you want to know about how to use your anger within that context, because they're the ones who write so powerfully about it. And I think we haven't in the UK. I just don't think we've drawn on that crossover between social justice and cultural democracy in quite the same way. And I think it's a really, really important thing to think about. But I'll share some of the text, including the Owen Kelly. I don't know if you can get it in print anymore, but anyway, I may have a PDF.
Perfect, thank you. And we can make sure we circulate those in an email afterwards. We have a couple more questions or comments in the chat. This one's for Abby from Marley and says, any practical tips for introducing a PAG group into organisations?
Okay, I think it's about, firstly, it's about a real openness to hear and listen and see. I think it's about putting the word out there and having a very clear idea of the first step, the first thing you want them to explore. So thinking about targeting invitations to key community members, key voices in the community, but also opening it up. And I think knowing that what we did was it was integral within our organisation funding. So we actually had funding in our budget to be able to pay people for their time. So there was an extra, you know, people being paid to be part of it. That was also really useful. And I think it's about giving it space and time. It takes time to get people to feel confident to share and really share what they want to say. So give it time and energy. It's a commitment, really. But we can have a chat. Please get in touch and we can talk about that more. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. We have another question in the chat, which is for Chrissy, which says, Chrissy, which agencies, bodies, organisations do you think are most useful and active ways in broadening our work in the social justice sector?
Yeah, I note Rachel. I noted Rachel's question about that. Hi, Rachel. And you know, and I've seen the wonderful work that Rachel's been doing with things like Citizens UK and really finding, you know, where those voices might be. I mean, I don't think I would, you know, at the moment, I'm in the Labour Party, and I'm really thinking that's not the place to go for social justice. I just think I think you have to be led by what you see within your own community. I think, if you're looking at your own community and you're looking at who's active and you're looking at where things are happening, then you will find those partners. I don't think this is necessarily going to be a national organisation in the same way that I think, in the context of this work, it's not, the Arts Council can only make top-down policies and advise the way that we may go forward. But I think if you're embedded within your community, if you begin to really realise, I'm going to spend time in my community, you will find those people and you will find those partners. And that's all I can really say. There are organisations, but I think it's people and the connections that you make with them, the connections you make with their passion to change things, to move things on, where you find that you can find a way of giving a voice to people and sharing your ideas and using the arts in order to lift up the way that they can present their thoughts and ideas too.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And I think, can I hand over to Abby just a bit for that? Because I know that Abby, in order to get above and beyond off the ground and the participant advisory group, you did a lot, like you said in your presentation, of that research and going out into the communities and making relationships. Could you tell us a bit more about working with those partners and how that's worked?
Yeah, it was interesting because we'd already done a bit of work with certain communities. Prior to going to Bootle and Birkenhead, we'd worked with the recovery community, with people who were homeless, with people with mental health issues. So we already had some inkling of some of the partners in those communities. And we got a little bit of hostility in some of the communities, people going, are you parachuting in to do something and then going again? Are you going to come with an agenda? Are you going to come and tell us what we're thinking? So for me, it was really about going in with a listening ear, going in with those two very clear questions to ask people in the community, but going in with a listening ear to organisations and contacting everybody and anyone saying, here we are, this is what we're here to do. We would really love you to work with you. We'd love to hear what you think about this, and to really invite that honest discussion and openness, to go to meetings, to go to networks, to really talk to people and sort of embed within the community. And there was a real feeling that there needed to be a trust built up. So some of the things that I did in communities, I was invited to be on the board of a women's centre. And so being on that board sort of almost helped people see that we weren't just there for the short term. We were there for longevity, and we were there to really support what was the work that was happening. And so very much it was about going into meetings, and often it would take 2 or 3 meetings with an organisation before they trusted me to go in to meet their participants and do that initial work. So it might be that I'd speak to one person, then have to speak to someone else, then go in and meet people, then they'd start to hear about the practice. I'd go in and do a taster workshop, and then they'd always ask me back and say, can you do another one for this group? So it really was a question of going in and going, I'm taking this slowly, and I'm going in on your time scale, not mine. I'm going in to really hear, but also to work with you, not against you, not despite you, but with you, and to really hear and to see you and to hear what you have to say, to witness.
Perfect, thank you. And I think, yeah, there was another question about kind of timescales, and I think from Abby, it seems like patience and tenacity and really building that trust over a long period has really worked for Above and Beyond and Collective Encounters. Sarah has put a great link to a article on asset-based approaches to the Creative People and Places programme, which you could check out. There was another kind of comment about how language was a common theme in both Chrissy and Abby's presentations, the power and need for common language theory or themes from Marley. And I guess, do you have any reflections on that language that is developed through these kind of interactions and long-term engagement? I'll go to Abby first, because you talked about a kind of theatre language being new to your community groups, but beyond that, I can imagine that a kind of new type of language was developed
Yeah, I think there's two things that I would say there. I would say that it's really, I have this bugbear, and it's a personal bugbear of mine, that I think if you are going to write about a community or write with a community, it needs to be in a language that's accessible for the community to read and understand and engage with. And you know, sometimes it's about translating that language into a space and really looking at rewording and making sure that it's accessible. But that's not ever about raising the bar low. It's always about having a high bar, but it's also about, if you know, not bamboozling people with language that is not used on a daily basis, you know, daily basis. But also I think that theatre has a language. It's important to learn about different ways of doing theatre and different techniques and different languages, and to make that accessible to people too, but to explain it in a way where people can embrace it, embody it and understand it. So I think there's twofold things going on. It's about clean language and clear language in document writing, but it's also about upskilling and enabling people to also have that dialogue with other theatre makers in the language of theatre. And I think both of those are really important within community and participatory theatre. Sorry, Chrissy, over to you.
No. I mean, that was really, really useful. And I think, you know, I'd like to talk about both those things. One is that, you know, language, of course, it must be accessible with people that we're working with. But also, I think it's really important to think about, yeah, as Abby said, you know, the language of theatre, because actually a lot of the language of theatre is about being collaborative, is about being collective, is about working together in different kinds of ways. And I think what I've tried to do through a lot of the work in the Masters and other things I've written is enable artists to realise you do have the language in your own work, you have reflective practice in your own work, you have all these things, but you don't always recognise that this can be used, you know, as a language. So I think it's really important that theatre begins to realise, you know, the way that it works, and that is a language that can be brought into the conversation of creating a much more open space for imagining new things. I'd also like to follow up Sarah's thing about, you know, asset-based thinking, because I think what's really, really important is for us to acknowledge the assets or the cultural capital that communities have. Communities know about the things that are problems for them. They know about the things that are issues for them. They know about the things that need tackling as far as they're concerned, but also they know the ways that you can tackle those things. And I think it's really, really important that we recognize the assets of that knowledge, of that situated knowledge, of that embedded knowledge. And we don't think that we're going to come in with some new kind of knowledge that we're going to impose on people, but that we begin to draw out that assets. And I was working recently with the city of Oslo, who want to make their cultural organisations more participatory, more, and they were saying in the end, but in the end, Chrissy, we need to give the money, don't we, to the arts organisations and the artists, because we'll be able to trust them to know how to spend it. And I just went, well, you know, you're working with migrants in Oslo, you're working with asylum seekers in Oslo, you're working with working communities in Oslo. Who better than a woman who's trying by herself to bring up a family, to ensure that they get to school, to ensure that they're dressed, to ensure that they're fed, to ensure that things happen, you know, the rent is paid, and to ensure that eventually, you know, they have a sense of themselves too, would be better to tell you how to manage a budget than necessarily a large arts organisation that's been funded magnificently in somewhere like Sweden for years and years and years. And they did actually begin to take that on board. And I think that's where we need to go with our thinking about assets-based projects. Who controls the money? Because if you control the money, you go into a project, then you are status 9 or 10, as Rachel will know in some of the theatre language that we use about status. You're already status 9 or 10 when 10 is high. And so you've got to really think about who's managing the money and the means of production. Sorry to bring it back to a little bit of a Marxist way of speaking about things, but it is the means of production. We produce things in theatre, and people need to have the means of that production.
Perfect, thank you. And I think that kind of links on to some other questions that are being asked about the PAG group and that kind of means and access to production and distribution of culture. I'm just going to have a look through. Sarah asked an interesting question about how do you know you are really working with the local community and not just another layer of community gatekeepers? Sarah, I wonder if you were there and you could expand on your question.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I've had my video off. I didn't realise. It's just something that always kind of sticks with me, because a lot of the time people, when you work with a local community, you have to, necessarily you use community groups to reach these people, and quite often those people who come forward are engaged in a lot of areas of life, arts and culture or otherwise, very vocal, confident people. And it's just that question of how you not necessarily past those people, that they are of value as well. It's just how do you ensure that you're engaging with the people who wouldn't necessarily come forward?
Can I answer a little bit of that? I think that's a really good question. It's a really hard question because you are trying to engage with organisations. I think with the Above and Beyond project, a couple of things I did was I did actually go into the street and just ask random people in the street to answer my questions, which I couldn't necessarily do now because of COVID, but I went out and I spent a lot of time where people were, talking to people who weren't engaging with organisations. I also went out with the community connectors and did doorstep knocks in particular communities. So in Rock Ferry, in Birkenhead, I went out with community connectors and knocked on 250 doors with people and went and talked about asking these questions, but talked about engagement in drama, inviting people to come to sessions. And some people that are in our core group and PAG group came in via the community connectors and then came to an open day at a community centre, and then started to come to the core group and then became part of the PAG group. So there have been people who weren't engaging in other organisations who've come up through that process, but it's one of those really, it takes time. So if you've got we were in community for 2 years, and that's not long enough, and we'd already been in community for 5 years before that, working with the community, so we were already had built up those relationships. I think it's very hard when you get short-term funding for stuff, which means that you can't go in and really build those relationships. And I think that it is a really big question. It's one we should always, as artists, be asking ourselves: who are we engaging? How are we getting people? How can we engage with people who maybe are really not engaging with anything? How can I really push that? But at the end of the day as well, though, it's about people electing to do things, and you can't make someone come to your workshop because that would be really undemocratic. But it's about offering that invite and just reaching out as far as you can.
Perfect, thank you. Chrissy,
if I was to follow up from that, I would just say, absolutely underlining everything that Abby said, the importance of time, the importance of not having parachuting in projects, the importance of spending time with your community, having time to talk to people, being able to sort of be a presence, be embedded in that place, be a presence that people are used to people being around, and having those, 5-7 years in which you're talking to the people in that community. I would also say the other answers are cups of tea and food, because what I realized, working with Heart of Glass in St. Helens, was that when they did projects where food was involved, there are a lot of people who actually, we know from the number of food banks we've got in this country, for whom food is actually really important. And the chance to have a cup of tea with someone is really, really important. And that's where you begin to see those people who would never, ever come to some sort of consultation about the arts or anything like that, but invite them into an occasion which offers people food, the possibility to sit down, to have a cup of tea, to talk with people. It's shameful that that's the way that we have to start. It's really shameful, but it's also, it's a reality that, and it also encourages, people can sit around, if people can sit in a space that actually isn't hierarchical, if you can sit in a space where they can choose where to sit, who to sit with, things like that. I think those are really, really important. It takes a lot of meetings, it takes a lot of time, it takes, real persistence. And also, I think, we've got to engage with where people are culturally. I mean, why are we so sure that what we're taking in culturally, or what we call arts, is what people want? That's why we have to listen. That's why we have to be there. That's why we have to see what's going on. and to spend that time. We can't impose those sort of things on people and think, oh yeah, we think this is a really good kind of form of art, let's all come along and join it. No, you might have to start, you know, with the group that's playing darts or something like that, and just find out, you know, where we can make those connections together, because we've got common aims about changing things socially, bringing about justice, bringing about equality.
Perfect, thank you. I think that kind of attitude of honesty and openness and really meeting people where they're at seems to be something, you know, a starting point to have those exchanges that can be really meaningful. I'm aware we're kind of short on time, and there's a lot of interest in the PAG group. And if you do want to know more, please do contact myself or Abby. We will share our email addresses after the event today, and we're happy to talk about the process of creating and sustaining the participant advisory group. There's a couple of interesting questions. There was one question that I thought was a kind of great last provocation, maybe, which is from Bex on language. And she says, I wonder whether the term outreach suggests a centre, i.e. democratising culture outwards, as opposed to cultural democracy recognising culture and assets located within communities. Is this something you've grappled with already, and do you have a different take on it?
I think it's a great question, actually, and it's one to think about, really. I think we use the term outreach projects because we have more centre-based projects and it's working out in the community. So that's sort of, you know, but I think it's something to think about. I don't think, you know, it's an interesting discussion, and maybe one for the next stage of this morning's meeting.
Yeah, hold on to that.
Yeah, I think it would be great to look at that as part of the open space. It's not a term I use anymore myself, but I also see the value of it as an explanation of some of the work that organisations are doing. But it is a term that I try to avoid myself. But I think it's, you know, it's why are we there? Why are we making theatre? Why are we making theatre with people? Why do we want people to engage with that theatre? What do we think that, you know, engaging with theatre is going to offer them? That we need to think about, you know, yeah, exactly the things that Abby's been talking about as ways and means of entering the community and tackling things differently. I just need to apologise that I'm going to have to go now. I've explained to Marianne and the others that I'm actually talking about very similar issues well, I'm not going, but I'm going to be talking in Serbia and the BTEC Polyphonia in Belgrade this afternoon. And we're talking about very many of the same issues that we've been talking about. But what they also want to talk about is theatre in silence, and why theatre may have stopped speaking out about some of the things it needs to speak out about. So I can report back to you about what they have to say there this afternoon. But thank you ever so much. It's lovely to speak with Abby and to hear your thoughts and to hear the very practical things you're doing on the ground. And thank you to Collective Encounters for inviting me. And I hope you have wonderful conversations in those open spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you so much for your contribution and provocation this morning. Thank you very much, and we hope to hear from you again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Perfect. So just to wrap up that kind of this portion of the event, if you are interested in our PAG group and how we run it, my colleague Annette has put the link to our interim report, which looks at everything from how we set it up to recruitment and to all the way through to evaluation and other things. Please do check it out. And if you want any more kind of detailed questions, Abby or one of the team will be happy to talk to you about it. So for the next portion of the event, we will be commencing an open space discussion. We'll have a break very shortly. I'm just going to share my screen again. So we will start the open space. So anything that you have heard this morning from Abby and Chrissy that may be provoking you into thinking more about various issues, we will be agreeing an agenda together after our break. I will skip through to that. So we will be filling in this agenda together. So over the break, have a think if there's anything that you would particularly like to discuss or interrogate in breakout rooms. So I'm going to stop sharing there and stop the record.